Outside a small-town saloon, a female veteran threw herself between a Hell's Angel and a gunman's rage. Her sacrifice turned the entire community against her. But when sunrise broke the next morning, what appeared outside the shooter's door would shake this town to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella "Izzy" Kane's hands trembled slightly as she wiped down the scarred wooden bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon for the fourth time that evening. The tremor wasn't from nerves, not anymore. It was the same shake that had plagued her since Kandahar, since the IED blast that ended her military career and left invisible scars deeper than any surgeon could reach. She pressed her palms flat against the cool wood, steadying herself, counting to 10, like Dr. Natalie Ward had taught her during their sessions at Highland Veterans Hospital. The Silver Dollar wasn't much to look at. Cracked leather stools, neon beer signs flickering their last gasps of life, and the persistent smell of stale cigarettes that decades of cleaning couldn't quite erase. But it was hers now, inherited from her late Uncle Frank, who'd left it to her with a mountain of debt and a note that simply read, "Izzy, sometimes broken things fix each other." The irony wasn't lost on her. A broken soldier running a broken bar in a broken town, Oakfield, California, had seen better days. The lumber mill that once employed half the town had shuttered 5 years ago, taking with it the hope and prosperity that had defined this place for generations. Main Street looked like a mouth with missing teeth. Empty storefronts with soap-stained windows standing between the few businesses still clinging to life. The Silver Dollar, Murphy's Hardware, and Sal's Diner were about all that remained of what used to be a thriving community. Isabella had returned home 8 months ago, medically discharged after serving 3 tours in Afghanistan. The woman who'd left Oakfield at 18, ready to conquer the world in army fatigues, had come back at 26 with a purple heart, a limp she tried to hide, and nightmares that made sleep feel like enemy territory. The transition wasn't going as smoothly as the VA pamphlets had promised. The few regulars who frequented the Silver Dollar were mostly older men, veterans from different wars, retirees nursing pensions and grievances, and the occasional trucker looking for a cold beer and a quiet corner. They'd accepted Isabella with the reserved politeness small towns reserved for their own, but she could feel the questions in their sideways glances. What happened over there? Why doesn't she smile much anymore? Is she really okay? She wasn't okay, not by a long shot. The nightmares came 3, sometimes 4 times a week. The phantom pain in her left leg, where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone, flared up whenever rain was coming. And the hypervigilance, the constant scanning for threats, the way her heart raced when someone approached from her blind spot. The inability to sit with her back to a door made social interactions feel like walking through a minefield, but the Silver Dollar gave her purpose. Something to focus on besides the ghosts that followed her home from the desert. Tonight was quieter than usual. Old Pete Martinez sat in his corner booth, nursing a whiskey and working on a crossword puzzle he'd never finish. Jenny Walsh, a local teacher going through a messy divorce, occupied a stool at the far end of the bar, staring into a glass of wine like it held answers to questions she was afraid to ask. The ancient jukebox in the corner played something low and mournful. Patsy Cline, Morning Love Gone Wrong. Isabella glanced at the clock above the cash register. 9:30 on a Tuesday night, in a town where most folks were in bed by 10. She was calculating whether she could close early when the rumble reached her ears. It started as a distant thunder, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. The unmistakable growl of a motorcycle engine, big, powerful, built for the open road rather than grocery store runs. Isabella's muscles tensed involuntarily. In Afghanistan, that sound would have meant incoming vehicles, potential threats, the need to be ready for anything. Here in Oakfield, it just meant trouble of a different kind. The engine noise grew closer, then cut off abruptly outside the Silver Dollar. Through the grimy front window, Isabella could make out the silhouette of a massive motorcycle, all chrome and black steel, gleaming under the weak streetlight. A figure dismounted, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with being noticed. Old Pete looked up from his crossword, frowning. Jenny Walsh shifted uncomfortably on her stool, suddenly very interested in her wine glass. The jukebox seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, Patsy Cline's voice fading to an uncertain whisper. Isabella straightened, wiping her hands on the bar towel tucked into her belt. She'd grown up in Oakfield, had seen the occasional biker pass through on their way to somewhere more interesting. Usually they were just tired riders looking for a beer and directions to the highway. But something about this felt different, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. The way old Pete's hand moved instinctively toward the baseball bat he kept beside his booth, a remnant from his own war, who fought in jungles half a world away. The door to the Silver Dollar swung open with a rusty creak that cut through the silence like a blade. The man who entered had to duck slightly to clear the frame, his presence immediately filling the small space. He was maybe 40, with graying temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. His jeans were faded, his boots worn but well cared for, and across his broad back stretched a leather vest adorned with patches that told a story Isabella couldn't read but somehow understood. The largest patch, centered between his shoulder blades, bore the image of a fierce eagle with outstretched wings, clutching a banner that read Thunder Riders MC. Smaller patches dotted the vest like battle ribbons, chapter locations, road names, dates that probably marked significant events in a world Isabella knew nothing about, but it was his face that caught her attention. Beneath the weathered exterior and the careful mask of indifference, she recognized something familiar. The same look she saw in her own mirror each morning, the weight of carrying too much, of having seen things that changed you in ways you couldn't explain to people who'd never been there. The stranger's eyes swept the bar, taking in old Pete's defensive posture, Jenny's nervous fidgeting, and finally settling on Isabella behind the bar. For a moment their gazes met and held. In that brief connection, Isabella felt an unexpected recognition, not of the man himself, but of the burden he carried. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who'd spent years shouting over engine noise and highway wind. "You serve cold beer here?" Isabella nodded, reaching for a glass. "What's your preference?" "Whatever's coldest," he replied, settling onto a stool with careful deliberation, as if aware that every movement was being watched and judged. As Isabella pulled a beer from the cooler, she noticed his hands, large, calloused, marked with small scars that spoke of mechanical work and hard living. But they were steady hands, patient hands, hands that knew how to fix things. She set the beer in front of him, their fingers brushing briefly as he reached for it. "Thanks," he said, and she caught something in his voice, gratitude that went deeper than appreciation for a cold drink. "Passing through?" Isabella asked, the question automatic but genuine. The stranger took a long pull from his beer before answering. "Something like that." He paused, studying her face. "You military?" The question surprised her. "How'd you know?" A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Takes one to know one. I'm Colt Hayes. Most folks call me Razor. Isabella Kane. Most folks call me Izzy." "Izzy." He repeated her name like he was testing how it sounded. "Army?" "3 tours, Afghanistan." She didn't elaborate and he didn't push. "Marines." 2 tours, Iraq. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Understanding, recognition of a shared experience that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't lived it. The tension in the room remained, but it had shifted slightly. Old Pete was still watching, but his hand had moved away from the baseball bat. Jenny Walsh continued to ignore her wine, but her shoulders had relaxed fractionally. Isabella found herself studying Colt more closely. The Thunder Riders patch, the other emblems adorning his vest. She'd heard stories about motorcycle clubs, most of them probably exaggerated or entirely fictional. But looking at this man, seeing the careful way he held himself, the respect he showed for her space, She wondered how much of what people believed was actually true. "Long ride?" she asked, refilling his glass without being asked. "Long enough." Colt's eyes wandered to the window, where his motorcycle waited in the amber glow of the streetlight. "Sometimes you need to keep moving until you find a place that feels right." Isabella understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. The need to keep searching for something, peace, purpose, a place where the ghosts couldn't follow. As the evening settled into a comfortable rhythm, neither Isabella nor Colt could have known that their chance meeting would set into motion events that would change Oakfield forever. That within hours, a moment of courage and sacrifice would transform a quiet Tuesday night into a legend that would ripple far beyond the borders of their small town. But for now, there was just the quiet understanding between two veterans, the soft hum of conversation, and the promise of a story yet to unfold. The peaceful atmosphere of the Silver Dollar lasted exactly 47 minutes. Isabella had just finished sharing a story about her Uncle Frank's legendary poker games when the sound of multiple engines shattered the quiet night. Not the single purposeful rumble of Colt's motorcycle, but the aggressive roar of pickup trucks driven by men with something to prove. Through the front window, Isabella watched 3 vehicles pull into the small parking lot, their headlights cutting harsh white lines through the darkness. The lead truck, a lifted Chevy with more chrome than sense, lurched to a stop just inches from Colt's motorcycle. The message was clear and intentional. "Trouble," old Pete muttered, his weathered fingers finding that baseball bat again. Colt's entire demeanor shifted. The relaxed posture, the easy smile, the comfortable conversation, all of it disappeared behind a mask of watchful tension. His hands, which had been resting casually on the bar, now gripped his beer bottle with white-knuckled intensity. "You know them?" Isabella asked quietly, moving closer. "Know the type," Colt replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man preparing for conflict. "Some folks see the patches and think they know the whole story." The truck doors slammed shut with the kind of unnecessary force that announced hostile intentions. Isabella counted 5 men, all local faces she recognized with growing dread. Brock Saunders led the group, his barrel chest puffed out with liquid courage and small-town righteousness. Behind him followed his usual crew, Tommy Kellerman, whose family had run the defunct lumber mill; Danny Morse, unemployed since the mill closed; Jake Phillips, a part-time deputy with full-time anger issues; and Vic Kowalski, who'd been looking for a fight ever since his wife left him for his brother. Isabella's military training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging exits, potential weapons, and tactical disadvantages. The Silver Dollar had only one way out through the front door, unless you counted the kitchen's back exit that led to a narrow alley. 5 against 2, no, 5 against 1, since she couldn't expect old Pete or Jenny to help, and she wouldn't want them to anyway. Brock Saunders shouldered through the door like he owned the place, his bloodshot eyes immediately locking onto Colt. The smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper cologne rolled off him in waves, mixing with the underlying scent of rage that Isabella had learned to recognize in Afghanistan, the particular odor of men looking to hurt someone. Well, Brock said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of a playground bully. "Look what crawled into our town." Colt didn't turn around, didn't rise to the bait. He simply continued nursing his beer, though Isabella could see the tension radiating through his shoulders like a coiled spring. "Just having a drink," Colt said evenly. "Not looking for trouble." Brock laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Trouble? That's rich, coming from someone wearing that patch." He gestured at the Thunder Rider's emblem on Colt's back. "You think we don't know what that means? What kind of scum rides with outlaw bikers?" Isabella felt her jaw clench. She'd heard this same tone before, the voice of ignorance wrapped in authority, of prejudice masquerading as justice. It was the sound of people who reduced others to symbols and stereotypes, who saw patches and leather instead of human beings. "Brock," she said, stepping forward, "he's just stay out of this." "Izzy," Brock snapped, his eyes never leaving Colt, "this is between me and the criminal here." "Criminal?" Colt finally turned, his storm-grey eyes meeting Brock's bloodshot stare. "You got a warrant? Evidence? Or are you just making assumptions based on my choice of transportation?" Tommy Kellerman stepped closer, emboldened by Brock's presence. "We know your type. Drugs, guns, intimidation. Hell's Angels thinking they can ride into our town and Thunder Riders," Colt corrected quietly. "Different club. But I'm guessing details don't matter much to you. The distinction meant nothing to Brock and his crew. In their minds, all motorcycle clubs were the same. Criminal organizations bent on corrupting decent, God-fearing communities. They'd watched too many movies, read too many sensationalized news stories, and convinced themselves they were standing on the side of righteousness. Isabella recognized the dangerous momentum building in the room. She'd seen it before, in the moments before firefights erupted in Afghan villages, the way tension ratcheted up degree by degree until violence became inevitable. The way reasonable men transformed into something darker when they felt their territory threatened. "Look," Isabella said, moving to stand between Colt and the advancing group. "There's no need for this. He's not causing any trouble. He paid for his drinks. He's been respectful." Respectful. Danny Morse laughed bitterly. "You call riding into our town on that death machine respectful? Wearing those colors like some kind of badge of honor?" Jake Phillips, the part-time deputy, puffed up with borrowed authority. "Maybe we should call Sheriff Morrison, have him run this guy's plates. I bet there's warrants, outstanding violations." "I bet there's not," Colt said mildly, reaching slowly for his wallet. "You want to see my license, registration, military discharge papers? All legal, all current." The offer to provide documentation seemed to infuriate Brock rather than calm him. "Military?" he spat. "Don't you dare claim to be a veteran. Real soldiers don't end up in gangs." Isabella's blood ran cold. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a roadside bomb, and she watched Colt's face harden in response. For the first time since he'd entered the Silver Dollar, she saw genuine anger flash in his eyes. 12 years, Marines," Colt said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "2 tours in Fallujah, 1 in Ramadi. Purple Heart and Bronze Star, so before you question my service—" "Bullshit!" Brock snarled. Any real Marine would be embarrassed to wear that trash on his back. The room erupted in sudden movement. Colt started to rise from his stool, his patience finally reaching its limit. Brock's crew surged forward, sensing blood in the water. Old Pete scrambled toward the corner, pulling Jenny Walsh with him. And Isabella stepped directly into the middle of it all. "That's enough!" Her voice carried the sharp crack of command authority, the tone that had once directed soldiers through life-and-death situations. "All of you, back off, now!" For a moment, the advancing men actually hesitated. There was something in Isabella's stance, in the way she held herself, that spoke of genuine danger rather than empty posturing. But Brock's alcohol-fueled rage was stronger than his survival instincts. "Move aside, Izzy," he growled, trying to shoulder past her. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't." Isabella stood her ground, her military training taking over completely. "This is my bar, and I decide who's welcome here. And right now, you 5 are the ones who need to leave." Brock's face flushed purple with rage and embarrassment. Being challenged by a woman in front of his crew was the kind of humiliation that small, angry men couldn't tolerate. Isabella could see the exact moment when his fragile ego snapped, when whatever restraint he'd been clinging to finally gave way. "You picking sides with biker trash over your own neighbors?" Brock's voice rose to a near shout. "Over people you grew up with?" "I'm picking the side of right over wrong," Isabella replied, not backing down an inch. "And right now, you're on the wrong side of both my bar and my patients." The standoff stretched taut, 5 angry men facing 1 determined woman and 1 quietly dangerous biker. Old Pete had his phone out, probably calling 911, but Isabella knew the nearest sheriff's deputy was 20 minutes away on a good night. Whatever was going to happen would be over long before help arrived. Brock's hand moved to his jacket pocket, and Isabella caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze. The outline of a pistol grip. In that moment, She realized this confrontation had moved far beyond harsh words and posturing. Someone was about to get hurt, and in the Silver Dollar Saloon, with neon beer signs casting their sickly glow over a scene spiraling toward violence, Isabella Kane made the decision that would change everything. Time slowed to the crawl Isabella remembered from combat zones, that strange dilation where seconds stretched into eternities and every detail burned itself into memory with crystalline clarity. She could hear old Pete's whispered prayers from the corner, the soft whimper of fear from Jenny Walsh, the steady tick of the wall clock marking moments that felt like hours. Brock's hand was fully inside his jacket now, his fingers wrapped around what Isabella's trained eye confirmed was a compact pistol. His crew sensed the escalation, Danny Morse and Tommy Kellerman spreading out to flank Colt, while Jake Phillips positioned himself near the door. They moved with the clumsy coordination of men who'd planned this confrontation but never considered the consequences. Last chance. "Biker!" Brock snarled, his voice thick with alcohol and righteousness. "Get on that death machine and ride out of our town, or we'll make sure you leave in a body bag." Colt remained seated, but Isabella could see the subtle shift in his posture, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, hands positioned for quick movement, eyes tracking multiple threats simultaneously. He was preparing for a fight he didn't want, but wouldn't run from. "I told you," Colt said quietly, "I'm not looking for trouble. Just finishing my beer and moving on." "Too late for that," Brock sneered, beginning to draw the weapon from his jacket. "Should have thought about that before you brought your criminal colors into our—" "Stop!" Isabella's voice cut through the tension like a blade, carrying every ounce of authority she'd learned to project in the chaos of war zones. "Brock, you pull that gun, and this becomes something none of us can take back." Brock paused, the pistol halfway out of his jacket, his alcohol-clouded judgment warring with some deeper survival instinct. "You defending him, Izzy? Really? After everything this town's been through, you're going to side with some outlaw biker over your own people?" "My own people?" Isabella stepped closer, her voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that had once made hardened soldiers snap to attention. "My own people don't threaten to murder someone for the crime of wearing leather. My own people don't wave guns around in my bar because they're too drunk and stupid to see past their own prejudices." The words hit Brock like physical blows, his face flushing darker with each syllable. Behind him, his crew shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to realize they'd followed their leader into something far more serious than a simple intimidation tactic. "You think you're better than us now?" Brock's voice rose to a near shout. "Think your time playing soldier makes you some kind of hero? Well, let me tell you something, Izzy. Heroes don't come home broken. Heroes don't hide behind bar counters, nursing their own failures. The personal attack was designed to wound, to drive Isabella back behind emotional barriers and end her interference. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Something crystallized in her expression, a hardening that spoke of lines crossed and patience exhausted. "You're right about one thing, Brock," Isabella said, her voice carrying an eerie calm. "I am broken. Afghanistan broke me in ways you couldn't possibly understand. But it also taught me something you apparently never learned, how to recognize real threats from imaginary ones. And right now the only threat in this room is you." Colt started to stand, perhaps sensing the conversation had moved beyond words, but Isabella's hand touched his shoulder, holding him in place. The gesture was gentle but firm, a silent communication that she had this handled. "Izzy, move away from him," Jake Phillips warned, his part-time deputy status making him think he had some authority here. "You're interfering with what?" Isabella's laugh was sharp and bitter. "What crime has he committed? What law has he broken? Being different? Riding a motorcycle? Wearing a patch you don't like?" Tommy Kellerman found his voice, emboldened by group dynamics and liquid courage. "Everyone knows what those clubs are about. Drugs, weapons, violence." "Violence?" Isabella's eyebrows rose. "Who's holding the gun here, Tommy? Who came in looking for a fight? Because from where I'm standing, the only violence I see is coming from you five." Brock's grip tightened on the pistol, his limited patience finally snapping completely. That's it. I'm done talking. He began to fully draw the weapon, his intentions clear and deadly. What happened next unfolded in the space between heartbeats. Isabella saw the gun clearing Brock's jacket, saw the wild determination in his eyes, saw the trajectory that would put bullets into Colt's chest. Her military training took over completely, muscle memory and ingrained instincts overriding conscious thought. She threw herself forward and sideways, her body intercepting the line of fire just as Brock's finger found the trigger. The first shot was muffled by Isabella's body, the bullet tearing through her left shoulder and spinning her around. The second shot, fired in panic as Brock realized what had happened, caught her in the side, driving her to her knees between Colt and the gunman. The saloon erupted in chaos. Old Pete's screams mixed with Jenny Walsh's hysterical sobs. Colt roared in fury, vaulting over the bar to reach Isabella as she crumpled to the floor. Brock stood frozen, the smoking gun in his hand, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process what he'd just done. Jesus Christ, Brock. Danny Morse backed away, his face pale with shock. You shot her! You shot Izzy! Isabella lay on the worn wooden floor, her blood spreading in an ever-widening pool, but her eyes remained focused on Colt's face as he knelt beside her. Are you hit? She whispered, her voice strained but urgent. No, I'm fine, Colt said, his hands already working to stem the bleeding, his marine training taking over. Why did you... Because it was right, Isabella managed, her breathing shallow but determined. Because that's what you do. You protect people. Brock still stood there, gun hanging loose in his grip, staring at the woman bleeding on the floor of her own establishment. The righteous anger that had driven him here was evaporating, replaced by the cold reality of what he'd done. He'd shot Isabella Kane, a veteran, a local, someone who'd served her country with honor, because she'd refused to let him commit murder. We need to get out of here, Jake Phillips whispered urgently, his part-time deputy status making him acutely aware of the legal ramifications. Before the real cops show up, but Tommy Kellerman was already backing toward the door, his face green with nausea. This is fucked, Brock. This is completely fucked. She's bleeding out because of you. Colt's voice carried a tone that made everyone in the room stop moving. If any of you take one step toward that door before the ambulance gets here, I will hunt you down. All of you. Do you understand me? There was something in his voice, in the way he held himself over Isabella's wounded form, that spoke of capabilities and resources beyond their understanding. This wasn't just an angry man making threats. This was someone with the skills and connections to make good on promises of retribution. Old Pete had managed to call 911, his shaking voice providing their location to the dispatcher. But the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and Isabella was losing blood fast. Too fast. As sirens began to wail in the distance, still far too distant to matter, Colt held pressure on Isabella's wounds and spoke quietly in her ear. Stay with me, soldier. That's an order. Isabella's eyes fluttered, but she managed a weak smile. Yes, sir, she whispered. None of them knew that old Pete had made a second phone call after reaching 911 to a number he'd found in Isabella's emergency contacts, listed simply as Thunder Rider's MC emergency. None of them realized that word was already spreading through a network of riders who took care of their own and those who protected them, and none of them could have imagined what dawn would bring to the quiet streets of Oakfield. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes after old Pete's call, its red and blue lights painting the Silver Dollar's walls in chaotic patterns that reminded Colt of tracer fire in the Iraqi night. By then, Isabella had lost consciousness twice, her face pale as winter moonlight, her breathing shallow and irregular. Paramedic Sarah Chen, a woman, Colt would later learn, had served as a Navy corpsman before returning to civilian life, took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. 2 gunshot wounds, significant blood loss, and a patient whose vital signs were dancing dangerously close to the edge of no return. What happened here? Sarah demanded, as she and her partner worked to stabilize Isabella. Their movements efficient and practiced. He shot her, old Pete said, pointing a trembling finger at Brock Saunders, who still stood frozen near the bar, the smoking pistol now lying at his feet where he'd dropped it. She threw herself in front of the bullets to protect him. His gaze shifted to Colt, who knelt beside the stretcher, his hands and shirt soaked in Isabella's blood. Sarah's eyes flicked between Colt's Thunder Rider's patch and Isabella's wounds, her expression hardening as she processed the implications. Someone had tried to kill this biker, and a local woman, a veteran, based on the military bearing she could see even in unconsciousness, had taken bullets meant for him. "Sir, I need you to step back," Sarah told Colt as they prepared to load Isabella into the ambulance. "I'm riding with her," Colt said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Family only. She saved my life." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Sarah pause. "I'm not leaving her." Something in his tone, in the way he looked at the unconscious woman, made Sarah nod. "Keep pressure on that shoulder wound during transport." As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle screamed into the night toward Highland Veterans Hospital, Sheriff Morrison finally arrived at the Silver Dollar. At 62, Bob Morrison had been keeping the peace in Oakfield for over 20 years, and he'd never dealt with anything quite like this. The scene told its story in blood and scattered furniture. Isabella's blood pooled near the bar, Brock's abandoned weapon lay where guilt had forced him to drop it, and 5 local men stood around, looking like they'd just awakened from a particularly vivid nightmare. "Jesus Christ." "Brock," Sheriff Morrison said, surveying the damage. "What the hell did you do?" Brock had sobered up considerably in the 20 minutes since pulling the trigger, the reality of his actions cutting through alcohol-induced bravado like ice water. "I didn't mean she wasn't supposed to. I was aiming for the biker." "You were aiming to commit murder," old Pete interjected, his voice shaking with rage and shock. "Isabella tried to stop you, and you shot her down like a dog." Sheriff Morrison began the slow process of separating witnesses, taking statements, and trying to piece together how a Tuesday night in a quiet bar had turned into a shooting. The story that emerged was both simple and damning. 5 local men had decided to run an outsider out of town, and when a respected veteran had stood up for what was right, they'd shot her for her trouble. Tommy Kellerman and Danny Morse were already distancing themselves from Brock's actions, claiming they'd never intended for things to go so far. Jake Phillips tried to invoke his part-time deputy status, suggesting this was somehow a justified law enforcement action gone wrong. Vic Kowalski just stood in the corner, staring at Isabella's blood, and probably reconsidering every decision that had led him to this moment. But it was Brock who would face the most serious charges. Attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment. The list would grow as the county prosecutor got involved. His life, already complicated by divorce and unemployment, was about to become infinitely more difficult. At Highland Veterans Hospital, Isabella was rushed into surgery while Colt paced the waiting room like a caged animal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow on institutional furniture and faded motivational posters that offered empty reassurances about healing and hope. Dr. Amanda Pierce, the trauma surgeon, emerged 3 hours later with blood on her scrubs and exhaustion in her eyes. "She's stable," she announced, and Colt felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. The shoulder wound was clean, through and through, minimal bone damage. The abdominal shot was more complicated. "We had to repair some internal bleeding, but she's tough." "Military?" "Army. 3 tours," Colt confirmed. Dr. Pierce nodded knowingly. "That explains a lot. She's got the kind of constitution that's been tested under fire. She'll pull through, but recovery's going to take time." As dawn approached, word of the shooting began to spread through Oakfield like wildfire. The story grew in the telling. A local veteran shot while protecting a stranger. A woman who'd served her country with honor, gunned down by her own neighbors for standing up to injustice. The reaction was swift and polarized. Some locals rallied around Brock, convinced that Isabella had betrayed her community by siding with an outsider. They whispered in coffee shops and grocery store aisles about misplaced loyalty and the corrupting influence of people who didn't understand small-town values, but many others felt a growing sense of shame and outrage. Isabella Kane was one of their own, a woman who'd put her life on the line for her country, who'd come home broken and tried to rebuild not just herself but her family's legacy. And they'd rewarded her service by shooting her for showing basic human decency. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called an emergency town meeting for the following evening, though she had no idea what she was going to say. How do you heal a community that had just witnessed one of its own nearly die for doing what was right? In the pre-dawn darkness, as Oakfield tried to process what had happened, old Pete made another phone call. This one was to his grandson Marcus, who lived in Phoenix and happened to know people in the motorcycle community. The conversation was brief but urgent. "Boy, I need you to pass along a message," Pete said, his voice still shaky from the night's events. "Tell your biker friends what happened here. Tell them about Isabella Kane and what she did for one of their own." Marcus listened to the story with growing amazement and anger. By the time his grandfather finished, he was already reaching for his phone to make calls of his own. In the tightly knit world of motorcycle clubs, word traveled fast, especially when it involved someone who'd shown extraordinary courage in protecting a brother. As the sun began to creep over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Brock Saunders sat in a holding cell at the county jail, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd shot a decorated veteran, a woman who'd served her country with honor because she'd refused to let him commit murder. But Brock's personal reckoning was only the beginning. Forces were already in motion that would transform his act of violence into something he never could have anticipated. Phone calls were being made, bikes were being started, and riders from across 3 states were beginning to converge on a small California town that most of them had never heard of. Isabella Kane had thrown herself between a bullet and an innocent man because it was the right thing to do. Now, as she lay unconscious in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, that simple act of courage was about to transform everything. The sunrise that broke over Oakfield that morning would be the last peaceful dawn the town would see for quite some time. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brock Saunders had been staring at the cracked ceiling of his jail cell for 3 hours when the sound began. At first, he thought it was thunder, a distant rumble that seemed to roll across the valley like an approaching storm. But as the noise grew louder and more distinct, Brock's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Motorcycles, not 1 or 2, but dozens, maybe more. Sheriff Morrison heard it too, stepping out of his office to peer through the blinds of the county jail's front window. What he saw made him reach for his radio with trembling fingers. "This is Sheriff Morrison," he said into the handset, his voice tight with disbelief. "I need every available unit at the county jail, now." "What's the situation, Bob?" came the crackling response from dispatch. Morrison watched the horizon shimmer with chrome and steel as motorcycle after motorcycle crested the hill leading into Oakfield. They came in formation, riding 2 by 2, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that echoed off the surrounding mountains. "We've got about 100 bikers heading straight for us," Morrison said, his throat dry as dust. In the lead rode a man whose presence commanded immediate attention. Gunner Savage Price sat his massive touring bike like a general surveying a battlefield, his silver beard whipping in the wind, his leather vest adorned with patches that told the story of 4 decades on the road. Behind him rode the leadership of Thunder Riders chapters from Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, and Oklahoma City. Men and women who'd dropped everything and ridden through the night after hearing about Isabella Kane. But the Thunder Riders weren't alone. Word had spread through the interconnected network of motorcycle clubs across the Southwest, and riders from a dozen different organizations had answered the call. Iron Wolves, Desert Phantoms, Road Devils, Steel hawks, natural rivals who'd put aside old grudges to honor a woman who'd shown courage when it mattered most. As the procession entered Oakfield's main street, windows began to crack open and curtains were pulled aside. Early morning joggers stopped dead in their tracks. Store owners preparing for the day stood frozen behind their glass doors, watching as what looked like an army of leather-clad warriors rolled into their quiet town. The bikes moved with military precision, their destination clear and unwavering, the county jail where Brock Saunders awaited his arraignment. They filled the parking lot, spilled onto the side streets, and continued arriving until the rumble of engines became a sustained roar that rattled windows throughout downtown Oakfield. Then, as if by some silent signal, every engine cut off simultaneously. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. Gunner Price dismounted his bike with the fluid grace of a man half his age, his boots hitting the asphalt with deliberate precision. Behind him, over 100 riders did the same, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance of intimidation. But they didn't storm the jail. They didn't shout threats or demand justice. Instead, they simply stood there, a wall of leather and chrome and barely contained fury. Their message clear, without a single word being spoken. Inside the jail, Brock had pressed himself against the far wall of his cell, his face pale with terror. Through the small window, he could see glimpses of the massive gathering, men and women whose very presence spoke of roads traveled and codes lived by. These weren't the cartoon villains he'd imagined when he'd pulled that trigger. These were real people with real loyalties, and real consequences for those who harmed their own. Sheriff Morrison stepped outside, his hand resting nervously on his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless against these numbers. Gunner Price approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, his bearing respectful but unyielding. "Sheriff," Gunner said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd spent decades shouting over engine noise. "I'm Gunner Price, president of the Thunder Riders Phoenix chapter. I believe you've got something that belongs to us. If you're talking about Brock Saunders, he's in custody awaiting formal charges," Morrison replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is a matter for the courts." Gunner nodded slowly, his steel-grey eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "Oh, we're not here for him. Not yet, anyway. We're here about Isabella Kane." The sheriff's confusion must have shown on his face, because Gunner continued without prompting. "Last night, that woman took bullets meant for one of ours. She threw herself between a gun and a Thunder Rider because it was the right thing to do. That makes her family, Sheriff. And we protect our family." Morrison glanced back at the assembled riders, noting the different patches, the various club affiliations. "These aren't all Thunder Riders." "No, they're not," Gunner confirmed. "Word travels fast in our world. When someone shows that kind of courage, that kind of honor, it resonates. These riders came from 4 states to pay their respects." As if to emphasize the point, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. Ruby Storm Bell wore the colors of the Desert Phantoms, a club that had been feuding with the Thunder Riders for 3 years over territory disputes. But she stood shoulder to shoulder with Gunner, old grievances set aside, in favor of something more important. "Where is she now?" Ruby asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "Highland Veterans Hospital," Morrison replied. "Still in critical condition." Gunner nodded grimly. "Then that's where we're going next. But first, we wanted to make sure you understood something, Sheriff. That woman in there is under our protection now. All of us." He gestured to the assembled riders. "Anyone who wants to hurt her, threaten her, or make her life difficult is going to have to go through us. All of us. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was something more fundamental, a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet certainty of men and women who'd built their lives around loyalty and mutual protection." From his cell window, Brock watched the exchange with growing horror. He'd shot a woman who was apparently connected to every motorcycle club in the Southwest. His simple act of drunken violence had brought down upon him forces he couldn't possibly comprehend or combat. Morrison found himself in an impossible position. Over 100 bikers had just informed him that they considered a local woman to be under their protection. It wasn't illegal exactly, but the implications were staggering. Isabella Kane now had a guardian army, and anyone who crossed her would face consequences that existed outside the formal justice system. "We understand each other?" Gunnar asked. Morrison nodded slowly. "I think we do." "Good." Gunnar turned to address the assembled riders, his voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "Highland Veterans Hospital. We ride in 10 minutes." The bikers began mounting their machines with the same synchronized precision they'd shown in dismounting. Engines roared to life, creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of Oakfield. As the procession began to move out, heading toward the hospital where Isabella fought for her life, the people of Oakfield began to emerge from their homes and businesses. They lined the streets like spectators at a parade, watching in stunned silence as over 100 motorcycles rolled through their town. Some faces showed fear, others curiosity, and a few displayed something that might have been shame, because everyone in Oakfield now understood what Isabella Kane's act of courage had wrought. She'd protected a stranger, and in doing so, she'd gained protectors of her own. At Highland Veterans Hospital, Dr. Amanda Pierce was updating Isabella's chart when the sound reached her ears. She looked up from her paperwork, frowning at the distant rumble that seemed to be growing louder by the minute. Then her pager buzzed with an emergency message from hospital security. "Massive motorcycle gathering approaching main entrance. Approximately 120 riders. Intentions unknown." Dr. Pierce dropped her chart and ran for the window, her heart racing as she imagined the worst. But what she saw in the hospital parking lot wasn't chaos or violence. It was honor. 120 riders had come to pay their respects to a woman they'd never met, whose courage had earned their eternal loyalty. And as Isabella Kane lay unconscious in her hospital bed, fighting to recover from wounds she'd taken while protecting a stranger, an army of guardians had assembled to ensure her safety. The sun was fully up now, painting the California sky in brilliant shades of gold and blue. And in Oakfield, everything had changed. The transformation of Highland Veterans Hospital that morning was unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. What had started as a routine Wednesday quickly became something extraordinary, as over 100 motorcycles filled the parking lot, their riders dismounting with a reverence typically reserved for sacred ground. Dr. Amanda Pierce found herself face-to-face with Gunnar Price in the hospital lobby, her medical training warring with her instinctive unease at the massive biker presence. But as Gunnar removed his leather gloves and spoke, she began to understand that her preconceptions might be wildly off base. "Doctor, we're here about Isabella Kane," Gunnar said, his voice respectful but firm. "We'd like to know her condition and what we can do to help. Are you family?" Dr. Pierce asked, following protocol. "As of last night, yes," Gunnar replied simply. "She took bullets meant for one of ours. That makes her our responsibility now." Dr. Pierce looked past Gunnar to the lobby, which had filled with riders of every description. Men and women, young and old, all wearing different patches but united by a common purpose. They weren't causing trouble or making demands. They were simply present, a visible demonstration of support and protection. "She's stable but critical," Dr. Pierce said carefully. "The surgery went well, but recovery will take time. She lost a lot of blood, and there's still risk of complications." Ruby Storm Bell stepped forward, her Desert Phantoms patch prominent on her vest. "Doctor, what does she need?" "Medical bills, specialized care, extended treatment. Whatever it costs." Dr. Pierce blinked in surprise. "The hospital has payment plans." "No plans," interrupted Dash Rebel Quinn, speaking for the first time since arriving. "Cash, full payment. Whatever she needs, whenever she needs it." As if to emphasize the point, riders throughout the lobby began reaching into their pockets, producing rolls of bills with the casual ease of people accustomed to handling their own affairs. Dr. Pierce had never seen anything like it. Total strangers volunteering to cover potentially massive medical expenses for a woman they'd never met. "There's more," Gunnar said. his tone suggesting this was just the beginning. Isabella's going to need time to recover, which means she can't work. We've heard about her bar, the financial troubles. That's being handled too. Outside the hospital, the scene was equally remarkable. Word had spread through Oakfield about the massive biker gathering, and curious residents had begun arriving to witness the spectacle for themselves. What they found challenged every stereotype and preconception they'd held about motorcycle clubs. The riders weren't loud or threatening. They sat quietly on benches, shared coffee from thermoses, and spoke in hushed tones out of respect for the hospital environment. Some were reading books, others worked on crossword puzzles. A few older bikers played chess on a portable set someone had produced from a saddlebag. Melody Frost, a local nurse who'd known Isabella since high school, approached the gathering with nervous curiosity. She'd always been taught to fear people like this, but the reality was completely different from her expectations. "Excuse me," she said to a woman with graying hair and arms covered in intricate tattoos. "You're here for Isabella?" The woman looked up from her knitting, actual knitting, which somehow made the entire scene even more surreal. "That's right, honey. I'm Angela Foster, but everyone calls me Angel. Isabella saved one of our family last night." "I heard about the shooting," Melody said, sitting down beside Angel on the bench. "I can't believe Brock actually pulled that trigger." Angel's expression hardened slightly. "Some folks let fear turn them into something ugly. But your friend Isabella, she chose courage instead. That's rare in this world." As the morning progressed, more Oakfield residents ventured to the hospital, drawn by curiosity and growing shame about what had happened in their community. What they discovered was a revelation that would ripple through the town for years to come. These bikers weren't the criminal stereotypes they'd imagined. They were teachers and mechanics, veterans and business owners, parents and grandparents who'd chosen a different lifestyle, but shared the same fundamental values of loyalty, protection and community support. Jake Phillips, the part-time deputy who'd been part of Brock's crew the night before, arrived at the hospital in civilian clothes, his shame evident in every step. He'd expected anger, maybe violence, when he approached Gunner Price. Instead, he found something worse, disappointment. "You were there," Gunner said, his voice carrying no heat but infinite gravity. "You were part of what happened to her." Jake nodded miserably. "I was. And I've never been more ashamed of anything in my life." "Shame's a start," Gunner replied. "But it's what you do next that matters." Jake looked around at the assembled riders, at the visible demonstration of loyalty and protection that Isabella had earned through a single act of courage. "What can I do? How can I make this right?" "You can start by being honest," Ruby interjected, joining the conversation. "When this goes to trial, you tell the truth about what happened, all of it. No covering for Brock, no minimizing what he did. And you can help us understand your community," Gunner added. "Because right now, we're trying to figure out how a place that raised someone like Isabella could also produce someone like Brock Saunders." Inside the hospital, Colt Razor Hayes maintained his vigil beside Isabella's bed. He'd refused to leave, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, eating cafeteria food, and watching the steady rise and fall of her chest like it was the most important thing in the world. When Isabella's eyes finally fluttered open that afternoon, the first thing she saw was Colt's concerned face, followed by an enormous bouquet of flowers that seemed to fill half the room. "Hey there, Sleeping Beauty," Colt said softly, his relief evident. "How do you feel?" Isabella tried to speak, her throat dry from the breathing tube that had been removed hours earlier. "Like I got shot," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Colt's laugh was shaky with emotion. "Well, you did. Twice, but you're going to be fine." "Did I?" Isabella struggled to remember the events clearly. "Did you get hurt?" "No," Colt said firmly. "You made sure of that. You saved my life, Isabella." As her awareness gradually returned, Isabella became conscious of sounds from outside her window, the low murmur of many voices, the occasional rumble of motorcycle engines, the sense of a large gathering nearby. "What's all that noise?" she asked. Colt smiled, moving to open the blinds so she could see the parking lot below. Isabella's eyes widened as she took in the massive gathering of motorcycles and riders, all apparently centered around the hospital. "Those are your people now," Colt explained. "Word got out about what you did. Every major club in the Southwest sent representatives. They're here to make sure you're safe and to let everyone know you're under their protection." Isabella stared at the scene below, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the response her actions had triggered. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No," Colt said seriously. "You did what almost no one would have done. You put your life on the line for a stranger because it was right. And now you've got family you didn't know existed." Dr. Pierce entered the room, smiling at seeing her patient awake and alert. "Ms. Kane, it's good to see you conscious. How's your pain level?" "Manageable," Isabella replied, though she was clearly struggling. "Doctor, all those people outside are taking very good care of you," Dr. Pierce interrupted. "Your medical bills have been paid in full. There's a fund being established for your recovery period. And I've never seen such dedication to a patient's well-being." As the afternoon wore on, Isabella received a steady stream of visitors. Gunner Price came to pay his respects, speaking quietly about honor and brotherhood and the permanent place she'd earned in their community. Ruby Bell brought homemade soup and stories about women who'd found strength in unexpected places. Dash Quinn presented her with a custom leather vest, adorned with patches that marked her as an honorary member of multiple clubs. But perhaps the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. Mayor Patricia Hendricks arrived in the late afternoon, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and a delegation of Oakfield residents who'd spent the day soul-searching about their community's actions. "Isabella," Mayor Hendricks said, her voice heavy with emotion, "I came to apologize. On behalf of the town, on behalf of all of us who let this happen." Isabella looked at the gathered officials and residents, seeing genuine remorse in their faces. "It wasn't the town that shot me, Mayor. It was one angry man making a terrible choice, but it was our prejudice that enabled him," Sheriff Morrison added. "Our assumptions, our fear of people we didn't understand. You nearly died because we failed to see past our own ignorance." As evening approached, the massive gathering in the hospital parking lot began to organize itself into something even more remarkable. Someone had produced a portable grill, others contributed food, and what emerged was an impromptu community celebration. Bikers and locals sharing meals, stories, and the beginning of genuine understanding. Isabella watched from her window as Oakfield began to heal, one conversation at a time. Her sacrifice had revealed the best in people she'd never met and forced her own community to confront the worst in themselves. But the most important healing was still to come. 6 months later, the Silver Dollar Saloon bore little resemblance to the struggling bar where Isabella Kane had nearly lost her life. The worn wooden floors had been refinished, the cracked leather stools replaced with sturdy new ones, and the neon beer signs that had flickered their dying gasps now glowed with renewed vigor. But the most significant change wasn't in the decor, it was in the clientele. Isabella stood behind the bar, her left arm still slightly stiff from the shoulder wound, but her smile radiant as she surveyed the Thursday evening crowd. At a corner booth, old Pete Martinez was teaching a group of Thunder Riders how to play dominoes, his laughter mixing with theirs as someone made a particularly dramatic play. Near the window, Ruby Storm Bell was deep in conversation with Melody Frost about starting a motorcycle safety course for local teenagers. Their different worlds finding common ground in shared concern for the next generation. The Silver Dollar had become something unique in Oakfield, a neutral ground where leather-clad bikers and local farmers sat side by side, where differences in lifestyle mattered less than shared values of respect and community. It was exactly what Isabella's Uncle Frank had envisioned when he'd first opened the place, though he'd probably never imagined it would take a shooting to make his dream reality. Colt Razor Hayes occupied his usual stool at the bar, having become such a regular fixture that some locals joked he should pay rent. His temporary stop in Oakfield had stretched into something permanent. When he'd discovered that Highland Veterans Hospital was looking for a motorcycle mechanic to run their new therapeutic riding program for wounded veterans, it was work that combined his technical skills with his understanding of how machines could heal broken spirits. "Another coffee?" Isabella asked, already reaching for the pot. "Always," Colt replied, watching as she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world. The tremor in her hands was gone, replaced by the steady grace of a woman who'd faced the worst and emerged stronger. Their relationship had evolved slowly, built on the foundation of shared trauma and mutual respect. It wasn't the dramatic romance of movies, but something deeper. Two wounded veterans helping each other heal, one day at a time. They'd found in each other what they'd both been searching for without knowing it: home. The bell above the door chimed, and Jake Phillips entered, no longer the angry, unemployed man who'd helped create the crisis that had changed everything. He wore the uniform of Highland Veterans Hospital security, a job Gunner Price had recommended him for after months of Jake proving his commitment to making amends. His transformation had been remarkable, from bitter, prejudiced follower to thoughtful advocate for understanding and reconciliation. "Evening, Isabella," Jake said, settling at the bar with the comfortable ease of a regular customer. The usual. Isabella poured him a Coke. Jake had given up alcohol entirely after the shooting, part of his personal accountability process. "How's the new training program going?" "Better than expected," Jake replied. "We had 12 veterans sign up for the riding therapy sessions this week. Turns out there's something about being on two wheels that helps people process trauma. The therapeutic riding program had been Colt's idea, but it had gained support from an unexpected alliance between the hospital administration and various motorcycle clubs. Veterans dealing with PTSD, depression, and physical disabilities were discovering that the focus required for riding, combined with the sense of freedom and community that came with motorcycle culture, provided healing that traditional therapy sometimes missed. Dr. Amanda Pierce entered the Silver Dollar. Still in her hospital scrubs after a long shift, she'd become a regular too, drawn by the unique atmosphere Isabella had created and the friendships she'd developed with people she'd never have met otherwise. "Rough day?" Isabella asked, noting the exhaustion in the doctor's eyes. "Long surgery," Amanda confirmed, accepting the coffee Isabella offered. "But we saved him. Car accident victim, multiple trauma. Reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." Amanda's presence was part of a broader change in Oakfield's social dynamics. The events of that night had forced many residents to examine their assumptions and prejudices, leading to a more open, inclusive community. The artificial barriers between different groups had begun to dissolve, replaced by genuine relationships based on individual character rather than superficial appearances. Gunner Savage Price made his monthly visit that evening, arriving with a small group of Thunder Riders who were passing through on their way to a rally in Nevada. His presence always drew attention, not because people feared him anymore, but because he'd become something of a local celebrity, the biker president who'd shown Oakfield what honor really looked like. "Isabella," Gunner said, enveloping her in the gentle bear hug that had become their traditional greeting. "How's our honorary sister doing?" "Couldn't be better," Isabella replied honestly. The custom vest the clubs had made for her hung proudly behind the bar, a symbol of the family she'd gained through courage and the respect she'd earned through sacrifice. The vest bore patches from over a dozen different motorcycle clubs, each one representing relationships forged in the aftermath of violence and nurtured through ongoing friendship. Isabella had never ridden a motorcycle in her life, but she understood the culture now, appreciated the bonds of loyalty and mutual protection that held these communities together. "Any word on Brock's appeal?" Gunner asked, his tone suggesting the answer mattered less than the asking. "Denied," Isabella replied. 15 years, no parole eligibility for 7. He'll have plenty of time to think about his choices. Brock Saunders had been convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to what amounted to the rest of his productive life in prison. His co-conspirators had received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but all of them would carry the weight of their actions for years to come. The trial had been a media sensation, bringing national attention to themes of prejudice, courage, and redemption that resonated far beyond Oakfield's borders. As the evening wound down, Isabella found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The broken soldier who'd returned from Afghanistan 18 months ago would hardly recognize the confident, connected woman she'd become. The trauma and pain were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined her existence. The silver dollar had become more than a business. It was a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, inclusion over isolation. Veterans found community here. Bikers found acceptance, and locals found their horizons expanded in ways they'd never imagined. Colt helped her close up, their routine as comfortable as an old song. As they turned off the lights and locked the door, Isabella looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the clear California sky. "You ever think about that night?" Colt asked, following her gaze. "Every day," Isabella replied. "But not the way you might think." "I don't regret it. Not for a second, even knowing what it cost you." Isabella smiled, thinking about everything she'd gained. The friendships, the respect, the sense of purpose that came from building bridges instead of walls. Especially knowing what it cost me. Because what I got in return was worth so much more. As they walked together toward home, the silver dollar stood quiet behind them, waiting for tomorrow's stories to unfold. In Oakfield, California, a town that had once been defined by its divisions and prejudices, something beautiful had taken root. Not perfection, that was a goal. Not a destination, but progress, understanding, and the kind of community that honored courage wherever it appeared. Isabella Kane had thrown herself between a bullet and a stranger because it was the right thing to do. In doing so, she discovered that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change everything, not just for the people directly involved, but for entire communities ready to learn what honor really means. And in the Silver Dollar Saloon, where differences were celebrated instead of feared, where respect was earned through character instead of inherited through conformity, the lesson continued to unfold, one conversation at a time, because that's how the world changes, not through grand gestures or political movements, but through individual people choosing courage over comfort, understanding over judgment, and love over fear, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.